All right, this is the vlog for September 3rd, 2018. And I think last night I talked about my dad's old model train set. And it sort of got me thinking about when I worked at the game store. I've been talking a lot about previous experiences I've had in tabletop gaming now that I'm um, going back to Dungeons and Dragons after so many years. I'm looking at my fingers right now because we had barbecue shrimp for dinner and I got a bunch of char marks. The grill was not super clean, but the shrimp are very tasty. So, one of the big differences with tabletop gaming now, as opposed to even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, when I was really into it, coming out of, well, actually, I was still in high school 20 years ago. Graduated 1999, so next year is going to be the anniversary, the 20-year anniversary of my graduation. Don't think I'm going to go to that one, but we'll see. I probably should, just because either the 20 or 25th one. Getting off track. So when I was tabletop gaming way back, we spent most of our money on the books themselves. And occasionally we got miniatures, sort of imagining painting them up and using them in our games, and never really going through with that because we didn't really know how to paint. And the cost of a miniature was pretty cheap, but the cost of actually getting the paints for it and the primer and having a table where you could do all that stuff. The guys that were making whole armies, they were, into painting and they could give us tips, but it was a pretty steep entry level cost, especially if you've already spent something like $100 on the RPG books to play the game, which I did. I did get into Warhammer 40,000 and then later Warhammer Fantasy when I got into college, but when I was still in high school, I had not messed around with that. So most of the actual play of Dungeons and Dragons that we did were on maybe a rollout mat that came with an adventure module, or large number of times just grid paper that we had drawn, the image of the map onto. And that was sort of typical. I think a lot of people did that. We didn't have a lot of cross communication between players to learn different techniques for playing the game either, because the internet was not nearly as central to everyday life that it is now. And we didn't have things like social media to the same extent that we have them now. We had bulletin board services, BBSs, where some people would, join and trade information and stuff. But even though I was on a BBS for gaming, I never really picked up any cool tips from people. I don't think a lot of people had gotten very clever at that time. When I started working at a game store, that was starting to change. I first started working at the WizKids store when I was still in college, and I actually took a year off to work full-time, or as close to full-time as I could make it. The manager didn't want to make me a key holder at first because she figured, why bother training this guy? He's going to go back to school, and it's going to be a waste of the investment. And I can see now how she would have thought that, from 2020 hindsight. But it was sort of frustrating because I really wanted to, get into it and learn how to manage a small business if I could. But sure enough, time came and and I was back to school. I kept working part-time, but it was just sort of a rough gig. My manager, who we all really actually respected, eventually stepped down because she was having her second child and wanted to spend time as a full-time mom. And that was when some of the other managers came in who were not as good. My friend tried to be the main manager, but he was actually younger than 18 years old. Or rather, excuse me, he was younger than 21 when he became essentially the manager, and the owners didn't want to give him that responsibility. So they acted as managers, and he was a assistant manager, even though he did all of the day-to-day running of the store. That fellow is now a producer at Microsoft with a lovely family of, I think he has a son and a daughter, and his wife is just great as well. Matt and Sarah and your kids, you guys are fantastic, and I still love both of you, and all four of you, although I have not met little Turnbull man and little Turnbull woman. So, when I started working at the store, I learned a whole lot more about the tabletop game experience, partly because that was the primary game that WizKids had been making, Mage Knight, which was little clicky bases that changed the stats of the units you were using as they got damaged. So it was important that we learn how to make terrain, because part of the idea of having the store is that people could come in, play the game, have a safe, fun place to play the game, and it would encourage them to buy more product. That worked sort of okay. The problem was the hardcore players were always looking for a deal, and they could find much cheaper prices. We had to sell at the recommended retail price in the store, but people were willing to sell entire cases for a discount online. And so the tournament winners were the guys that were buying all those figures online, figuring out how to make perfect armies now with a lot more communication, open channels, and the budding beginnings of social media. They were learning how to make armies that were almost certain to beat tournaments. And the reason they beat tournaments was that the figures that you won from winning the tournaments were unique, and the only way to get them was from winning the tournaments. So, just another reason why that whole experiment generally was doomed to failure from the start. But we did make a lot of terrain. I learned how to use foam board, use a special foam cutting tool to create hills and ridges that you could set units on. We had a lot of trees. The primary way of making forests was, again, foam board. Use a little bit of hot glue on the bottom of the tree, stick it into the foam board, let it dry, and now you had a mobile forest that you could put wherever you wanted on the board. It was only important to make sure there was space between the forests to let units move in and out of them, and to set the unit on the actual piece. But that was still over 15 years ago. And in the last 15 years, we've seen another major innovation in tabletop gaming. Although it wasn't, primarily designed for tabletop gaming, it has made a big difference in that particular industry. And that's 3D printing. What this is, astonishingly, is a ruined bit of castle wall. And you can see it's sort of L-shaped. And it's to scale with most 25 to 30 millimeter models, which is the vast majority of not only tabletop war games, but Dungeons and Dragon miniatures as well. And this I ordered this morning, and it arrived this evening, which just goes to show you how amazing Amazon Prime is, and it's well worth the money I spend every year on a subscription. Now, the actual terrain pieces themselves do show one of the major limitations, although it's not showing up on camera very clearly. One of the big limitations of 3D printing is a sort of crosshatch texture that tends to permeate everything that's 3D printed. This is not the first time I've bought 3D printed material, by the way. I've actually bought quite a few little accessories for Transformers, for my transforming figures. Here we go. On the bottom, you can actually probably, even in this light, see, this diagonal line indicates where the actual struts that hold this whole thing together. Basically, it's a lot of cross struts for structural reasons that form nice strong triangles with the straight angles of the piece itself. And then this brick pattern is just a texture overlaid over that interior sort of thing. The whole thing is quite light, but also very sturdy. It's not, I'm not worried about it breaking. I can toss it around. If I really started to pull on this, I'm sure it would break, like anything made of plastic tends to. But I'm not worried about it in the interim. It does have one other curiosity. Most 3D molded plastics have mold lines where the top and bottom of the mold come down. There will be lines along the edges where a little bit of excess plastic comes out, or if the mold isn't exactly centered, pieces will be offset just slightly, and you'll usually have to file those down with a file to make them smooth. This doesn't really have that problem. Instead, it's got hair. I mean, that's really obvious right there. These are the tendrils of the nylon plastic material use to do the 3D printing. And they're not terribly common. You just have to go in and find them all and pluck them. And then it's ready to use. It's also a little bit tricky to paint. You generally want to have at least 2 coats of primer. One to sort of create a base texture for the second coat to stick to. And that second coat is what your hand paint is going to stick to. So generally you want to do a single coat, let it dry. That can take usually an hour is safe, but if you really want to, you can let it dry overnight and then apply a second coat. And then you definitely want to wait about 24 hours, or I think we usually could wait 12 hours, although that was in excess of a work day. So most of the time we were priming stuff when I worked at the game store and painting it the following day. This isn't the only stuff I picked up. I also picked up a bag, many bags actually. I picked up a bag of 20 palm trees, about 30 random deciduous trees, and 100 stalks of bamboo to create sort of forest landscapes as well. And I've got some more stuff coming in the mail. I've got some cedar trees and some more of these 3D printed houses. Or, well, this is just castle ruins, but the ones I have coming will be houses and fences, which should offer a nice bit of visual diversity when it comes time for me to keep playing this. And as I said last night, even if I don't actually keep playing Dungeons & Dragons as a game, I'm having so much fun with this stuff. I really want to paint this now. We'll see. Anyways, in the meantime, oh, one other thing. This is not a perfect process. These should not have anything there. These are planks of plastic, essentially, left over from the process. I wanted to show those off. I can probably just snap these out with a little bit of force, or I could leave them in and sort of make them boarded over, you know, put little extra stuff to make it look like it's wooden planks, but this one's not as good. I'll worry about that after the video. Anyway, I'm Eric Spornitz, and tomorrow will be better.